A professor at the New York University School of Law and a fellow at the Hoover Institution, Richard Epstein is one of the nation's leading constitutional scholars and one of its leading libertarian thinkers. The meta issue of the day, inequality. Wage stagnation for the middle class for some decades, but an increase in household income for the wealthiest 1% of American households over the last 35 years, I looked this up, of 275%. And I found this quotation from my friend Richard Epstein. Quote, "Inequality can be a wonderful force for innovation," close quote.
Yes.
Explain yourself.
Well, I have to explain two things. First, the disparities, and then the second point. There are two ways in which you could solve the inequality question. One of them is you could take from the rich and hope to give to the poor. The first half of the program always works. The second half always goes astray. The other thing that you could do is you could try to eliminate the various barriers which prevent middle class and lower income people from moving up. And those are not macro policies having to do with financial situations in the Federal Reserve. It essentially means unlocking the employment relationship by getting rid of all of the things that the proponents of equality have put into place.
Such as?
Minimum wage laws make it harder for unskilled workers to get their first job, which makes it impossible for them to get their second job. Anti-discrimination laws makes it harder to hire minority people because it's more difficult for somebody to fire them. Strong unionization gives various kinds of wage increases to a select group of individuals, but it shuts out large numbers of other workers. What you have to do in these things is to completely deregulate the labor markets. What will happen is, in a competitive market, as productivity increases, wages will start to increase, and that will be sustainable because the persons paying the money are getting something that's worth it. Are there going to be excessive returns to capital? The answer is no, because of the competitive process. What's happened here is all of the last 6 years we've been running the progressive program. And that program has essentially resulted in real terms of a decline in income at the median level of about 4 or 5%, depending on how you count these sorts of things. It is a direct consequence of the way in which we have been doing this. Now, that's the practical answer. Now, the theoretical question is really very different. It's, do we mind about inequality as an abstract matter?
Right.
And the answer is, suppose the two of us start at 10, and I find a way to go to 20, and you only go to 11. We've increased the inequality, and we've increased the wealth of both people. Technically, amongst the economists, that's a social improvement. But according to the egalitarians, and there's really a terrible situation because the gap has gone from 0 to 9. You don't want to get yourself into that frame of mind. Now, why is it that it turns out that the gaps in a market system run that way? This has to do with the problem of incentives. What happens is if somebody comes along and creates something that gives enormous value to everybody else, they may move up 1 or 2 units, and that one person may move up $1 billion. Right. But do you think we're going to be better off in a world without a Steve Jobs or an early Bill Gates on the grounds that their great money is going to go to waste now that they have it, whereas everybody else is going to be denied the funny apparatuses that they've been able to produce?
Okay, so let me make sure I understand the Richard Epstein position. 2 points, both of which are pretty arresting. Let's put it this way, they'd be arresting if you saw them in the New York Times.
Yes,
astonishing. Position number 1 is, you don't care about inequality per se. You don't care how big this gap is, as long as the person down here is moving up.
Right.
The gap, you really don't care about the pattern of distribution, as long as those least privileged are making progress.
And they will only make progress in an open market.
And then the second, which brings us to the second point, which is also very arresting. Wage stagnation is not a result of the new normal. It's also not, I'm surprised that you didn't mention globalization.
I will.
All right. But fundamentally, wage stagnation is a result of intentional government policies which have made matters worse, not better.
Yes, they're trying to protect workers, and you limit their options. It doesn't help.
All right.
What globalization does, and it's very important, is it means that unionization can no longer work for the benefit of unions or their members. If you're going to be getting goods from all sorts of places, there are no firms around today, unlike, say, 50 or 60 years ago, that are going to be protected from competition by government regulation or oligopolistic formation. If you unionize a competitive firm and you try to get a monopoly rent, you drive the firm out of business. So what's happened is...
As witness General Motors.
Yeah, General, well, 500,000 workers in 1979 and 41,000 workers when it went into bankruptcy some 35 years later. So you don't want to get yourself ever into that frame of mind. And what happens is the administration has doubled down on this. All of the initiatives that have taken place either through the General Counsel of the National Labor Relations Board or through the board itself are trying to make things easier to do. Unionization. Now, elections, those are things which have actually been quite well run by the board. They want to shorten it. That will mean that the workplace is going to be under perpetual turmoil as firms will always be worried about unionization. But more importantly, you saw that the McDonald's chief officer was let go the other day. But they have another problem from the board. The General Counsel has decided that McDonald's is the employer of every worker of every franchisee that it has, all 15, 17,000 of these franchises.
Who has decided that?
The General Counsel of the Labor Board. So he's going to sue them. So now instead of having each worker having only one boss, they've got two. And you're putting McDonald's in a position where the entire franchise model that it and every other franchise arrangement has used for the past 50 or 60 years is now in jeopardy because of the Labor Board. But
those franchise operations are where a lot of people get their first job.
And they're also a place where a lot of middle-class people get their first proprietary type interest. Right. And so what you're doing is, you heard everybody, the basic flaw in most systems about regulation is you assume that if you restrict the opportunities of management, you've helped labor. But these are contractual arrangements, and any time you hurt one side to the contract, it radiates through and it hurts the other side as well. Okay. So the shrinking pie is always a losing proposition.
Last question on inequality. And on this one, I've got you.
Sure.
You ready?
No.
So, fine, the pattern of inequality doesn't matter as long as the people on the bottom are making... Well, I'll give you that. But here's where it does matter. If you get people who are fantastically rich at the top, they end up getting, it distorts the entire political system. As witness, just recently, the Koch brothers announced that they and organizations they have founded and their rich buddies intend to spend, rich individuals,
$700 million plus.
Almost $900 million in the 2016 election cycle, which is more than the Democratic Party or the Republican Party spent in the last presidential election cycle. That's an outrage on the face of it.
No, let me give you a slightly different interpretation of what's going on about all of this. One of the things that we note is that you can measure the success in terms of political abilities by figuring out which way the transfer payments start to run. If the Kochs were as good as you started to think, then you'd expect that the top 1% would be really in clover when it comes to taxation and so forth. But essentially what happens is if it has, let's say, 20% of the income, which is a lot, it's got 40% of the tax burdens. To understand the public choice theory, if you're sitting there as Mr. Moneybags, you have ability to fight, but you're also a perfect target. And even though you have a lot of dollars, the other guys may have a lot of votes. And so what it does is it becomes some kind of a standoff. What you really want to do is to create a political system in which there's so little intrigue going on by way of government initiatives that the Kochs will find it perfectly silly to spend money on politics because there's nothing that they want to be able to get. But given the current structure of political rights in the United States today, everything is contestable, everything's up to game. And at that point, the Kochs are going to come in, and the unions are going to come in, and the activist groups are going to come in, and basically most of this stuff is going to be destructive. You talked about my book, The Classical Liberal Constitution. The central theme of that book is you want government structures and individual rights to be sufficiently stable that whenever the government has to regulate a tax, it's going to do so in a way which will raise everybody simultaneously. Current politics is I win, you lose. Right. And what the Supreme Court does is sits benevolently beside and it applauds a trend that it is unwilling to stop.